Peter Boghossian, welcome to Dad Saves America.
Thanks, John.
So, you put on your website that you're a philosopher, a father, and an author, obviously an author. What do you want to add to that? Round that out for me. Who are you?
I like thinking about thinking. I like thinking about why people believe things. I like thinking about and reading about and writing about ideologies, how to help people communicate across divides. I picked those philosopher, author, father because for me, they have identity level salience.
What does that mean?
I think first and foremost, I'm a philosopher. I enjoy thinking and I enjoy trying to figure out how to be less wrong more often. I like to write and publish, so I'm an author. And I'm a father. I have 2 kids. I just visited my son. I'll be visiting my daughter at the end of this month.
Identity level salience. I feel like understanding identity is become the central question of our times. Maybe it's just the central question of philosophy and life for all times, but something's different right now, it feels like.
I think it feels different now because it is different. Any criticism or any questioning of any form of identity whatsoever, sexuality, racism, is there systemic racism, etc., people will link that to a personal attack on themselves. I think this has always been, we've seen this in religion, we've seen this throughout the ages, but now it's particularly virulent and nasty.
So I feel like how I encountered you was first with the Grievance Studies Affair, these papers, and they cut right at this. So right from the beginning, as far as like you know me as a intellectually curious person and encountering your work, it was around these identity issues. They've been talked about to death, but I think for those that might not know about this, or what was that like? Lay out what you and James and Helen did, and what are your favorite paper names? Because the names of these papers are hilarious.
So I was, in a sense, lucky, or I was unlucky. I was in Portland teaching at Portland State, which was truly an inconceivable ideological sinkhole. There was just no escape from the people who were caught in that madness. Something was off. I didn't quite know what it was, 2011, 2012. I started asking questions. I was told I was committing microaggressions. I was told that questioning was a microaggression. Asking for evidence for policies that are being institutionalized was a microaggression. Trigger warnings, safe spaces, microaggressions. Asking for evidence of a microaggression is itself a microaggression. So I started to realize that there was a problem. Where are my colleagues getting their ideas? These ideas are totally unhinged from reality. They're completely deranged. There's no questioning the ideas. So I started to dig a little bit into literature, what we term grievance studies literature, those subjects that deal with race, gender, identity, basically, trans issues in particular. That's extra crazy. In 2017, we published a paper that people lost their minds about. The conceptual penis is a social construct. I don't know if you've read it, but I think it's extremely funny. It basically argues, among other things, that penises are responsible for climate change. It was a Sokal-style hoax paper. And the goal of the paper was to show that there was a problem in gender studies. And so we wanted to see if we can get an completely broken, truly crazy paper published. And we did, and it was in the style of Alan Sokal, who's now a friend of mine, who's a physicist and mathematician at NYU, who published a fake paper in the most famous postmodern journal, Social Text. So we copied that style for the conceptual penis in 2017, and of course the usual suspects lost their minds and said, this paper doesn't prove what you think it does, if, this is a low-level journal, you only did one, you got to do multiple papers. So I call up James Lindsay, and I'm like, all right, this is awesome. They gave us a roadmap. Let's do it. Let's just do exactly what they've told us to do. They've told us exactly what we need to do to make the point. Let's see if we can do it. So we delved into the literature. Really, I think I lost quite a few brain cells in that process, but we delved into the literature, figured out what the claims were, what the assumptions were, and then we wrote 20 intentionally broken, completely crazy, often vile, reprehensible papers, and then we just started getting them. We started landing those all over the place, in exactly the kind of journals that they told us. Journals that specialize in gender studies. We got one, for example, in the best gender studies journal in the world, which is Hypatia. That's a funny one. We never talk about that because it's too complicated for most people to understand. People like the simple ones, like the dog park, that, like everybody, you can meme that out, everybody gets it. But the other papers were more complicated. We got busted by the Wall Street Journal after we had 7 published. I'm quite confident we would have, because we got better at writing them as we went along. And 10 months, my guess is by the end of the year, if we didn't get busted, we probably would have had 12 or 13.
So lay out for the viewer what this actually means, because I think for a lot of people, academia and its systems are opaque.
Yeah.
So you're talking about these journals, like what is a journal? Why did this matter so much? And we got dinner last night and we were talking about this idea of the sort of smuggling of ideas or laundering of ideas.
Idea
I want to
laundering.
get into that. So, what are these journals, and why is it such a kind of gotcha to produce nonsense and have it be accepted?
Yeah, it's a great question. So the papers were actually not nonsense. They were vile and despicable, but they played into the moral orthodoxy. The purpose of the journals is to forward certain conclusions that then affect public policy. So let's take a step back. So a peer-reviewed journal is not like a periodical. It's not like a blog post. There's a reason that they're called peer-reviewed. Your peers review these. So people who have domain-specific expertise read the articles that you submit, and if they find that it passes, it's good enough to get in, it's published in those journals. And so the way the system, the university architecture and the promotion and hiring system is set up is that in general, there are some exceptions to this, but as a general rule, 7 papers in 7 years gets you tenure. So 7 peer-reviewed papers that show that you're an expert in a subject area as determined by your peers. They're then published in a journal, and then the professors show when they go up for tenure, look, I've published here, 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 here. I am a scholar. I've met certain benchmarks. Now I have tenure, which is a job for life.
So everything about that too, I think the average person sounds bizarre, right? So I'm going to write an article. It's going to go to this cloistered group of people maybe I don't know them, but there's a chance I do know them because I'm in this sort of very particular, strange little subset of a discipline. Like they all seem to have become like that. Like, so I'm not just an economist. I'm a international macroeconomist that focuses on the Asian Pacific trade. So there's like 14 people that do that, and I'm going to write a paper about that, and then 5 or 6 of the 14 are going to read it and then say, yeah, this is good, and put it in this publication. Like, was that ever a thing that made sense and works? Like, what's the best version of what that is supposed to be doing, so that me, the skeptic who thinks academia sort of sucks, why should I trust that worked ever?
Oh, okay, so I'm going to answer that question, and there's another massive piece to this, a massive piece. So the reason that you trust the reason, if it's done ideally, is because we need to have a system in which we vet knowledge. everything. There's fake media, there's disinformation. So we need to have some kind of a gold standard, something upon which we can rely and trust. And that something should be then used to inform our decisions in the world, our public policies, how we live our lives, because we know that people have tried to falsify those things. It's Karl Popper's notion of falsifiability. They've tried to show that the best minds have of people who know the subject area, right? The best minds are people who hold academic positions, who are trying to show that those ideas are false. And that's one of the ways that we gain knowledge in science. And most of the peer-reviewed process, for example, in psychology has a massive problem right now. It's called a replication crisis. So this speaks to your point.
Yeah.
50% of papers in psychology can't be replicated. So if someone goes to a clinician seeking help with either a psychological disorder or what have you, it's a coin flip. It's a toss of a coin whether or not that clinician has been trained in something that can effectively help patients. So yes, you're correct in that the system could have been broken for a very long period of time, and because we weren't replicating studies, for example, in psychology. But this is far worse than that. This is far worse. This is very specific disciplines forwarding very specific conclusions about very specific identity markers: race, gender, trans status, sexual orientation, etc. And the reason that matters is because we need to study these things. These are indispensable aspects of human life. Sexuality is extraordinarily important. How we construct institutions and fairness and systems, that's incredibly important. That we don't have racist systems is incredibly important. And
Yeah.
if you don't, the purpose of the journal is to forward certain narratives and accept certain papers. So they themselves have been ideologically captured. The whole system is a way to replicate the dominant moral ideology. And so the other parts of this that are so important to understand is that if you don't get those 7 papers in 7 years, you will not get tenure. You will not have a job for life. So you're almost forced to write to the orthodoxy. You're almost forced to write in a way that you forward certain conclusions that the raison d'etre of the journal incorporates in its very structure. Now, the other piece that's important in this, that's just vital to understand, is that professors then take those journal articles and assign them to students in class. Is that clear?
Yeah.
Okay.
They become accepted science.
Correct. They become, this is the new canon. This is the canon. This is the knowledge and information that we pass on to the next generation of leaders. These people will go into administrative positions. They'll go into governmental positions. These people will make decisions in public policy that affect all of us. But the whole thing is a house of cards. It's all untethered to reality. It's all the musings of ideologues, all of it, literally all of it.
So I want to come back to what you did with these papers with James and Helen, and then we'll expand out beyond that. So it's funny because you said it's 7 to get tenure, and I think Claudine Gay's written 9 papers total, something like that.
Okay, that is I would love to go into that conversation. Okay, so that's another conversation entirely. Happy to have that, and no books, by the way.
Yeah. So okay, so you write a bunch of stuff that is sort of pantomiming this sort of, I'll just say woke philosophical framework, these, critical theory, critical studies, mindset things going in through, well, I won't read that one because we're kind of a family show. A lot of them I don't want to read actually, but yeah, human reactions to culture and queer performativity at urban dog parks in Portland, Oregon. So that's the popular one that people have.
That's the one that got us busted.
That's the one that got you busted.
Yeah.
But so what was that? What was the thesis of the paper?
Oh my God.
Do you remember? It's like it's hard.
I just even telling you is so crazy. I mean, this is a family show, so I don't know how much I can say, but
Try
so
to keep it as PG as you can.
okay. So
Or maybe pick another one that might be a little. I know it's hard because all of these are like that though.
well, that was the part of the point, right? I mean, part of the point is to make them so utterly outrageous that any sane person who looked at that would be like, "What?" You know, put white people on the floor in chains and speak over them as a form of experiential reparations. You know, I mean, some of the papers, you know, and we had two versions of Adolf Hitler's Mein Kampf that we translated. One, we just straight out took out Jews and put in white men. And then the other one was more of a rewrite of Mein Kampf. But the
So okay,
dog
wait,
park
yeah,
paper, we
right.
basically said that some woman, I think her name was Helen Helen Wilson, closely examined the genitals of items, something crazy like 10,000 dogs, but never in the heavy rain. And then she used black feminist criminology, which literally had nothing to do with it, like literally nothing. By the way, I chose black feminist criminology because I needed something that they could not criticize. They could not criticize black feminism. So I figured if I put black feminism in there, the likelihood of this paper getting accepted, even though it was truly crazy, would have been much higher because they couldn't critique it. They couldn't offer any critique of it because it would go against the whole purpose of the journal in the first place. So basically, they came to certain conclusions. Like I can't remember the exact line, but you know, unfortunately, we cannot leash men like we leash dogs, and we said these are condoning spaces. And it was really a crazy, crazy paper. And just numerically, the data could not possibly have added up. I mean, just imagine somebody closely examining the genitals of 10,000 dogs and then interrogating their owners as to their sexual orientation.
So, so you produce like a range of vile and ridiculous things that goes from inspecting dog genitals to just submitting Mein Kampf with Jews swapped, and these get accepted into these so-called prestigious
Well,
academic journals in gender studies and all of
you
this.
don't need the so-called, they were actually prestigious. I mean, the impact factor on those journals, impact factor is a way to assess their gravitas, their weight. The impact factor on those journals was quite high. So one, I never talk about this, but it's probably worth talking about because I think it's interesting, but it doesn't, it's just too complicated it doesn't meme out well to the public. But the one, we submitted two pieces to Hypatia. One we're rewriting before we got caught, but the other one was one of my favorites. Remember I told you we did the conceptual penis as a social construct in 2017? Well,
Yeah.
in this paper, again, remember, we're submitting these under fake names. And we had all fake institutes in case anybody looked. We had like faked pictures of people that we just pulled online and photoshopped them a little bit. But the paper, so Hypatia is the top journal. The paper was, I can't remember, it's like the title was something like When the Joke's on You. And in that paper, we criticized rather brutally James Lindsay and Peter Boghossian. And we said that James Lindsay and Peter Boghossian's paper of the conceptual penis doesn't work because you have to punch up and they punch down. But the paper was When the Joke's on You. And they were thinking the joke's on Peter Boghossian and James Lindsay. But the joke was really on Hypatia because we published a paper criticizing ourselves and which we were actually punching up at the journal, and they accepted it.
Years ago, there was this undercover sting of this organization called Acorn.
Oh yeah.
And I know actually some of the folks that were involved in this thing. It was like it was James O'Keefe
Yep.
from formerly of Veritas, and Hannah Giles, and they went into this organization that was claiming to be helping people, and basically pretended to be um, a, a, a a pimp and a prostitute that wanted to get help setting up essentially a child sex operation. And the people at this, deeply political community organizing enterprise went about trying to help them do that and get government subsidies to do it. And when that was released, it destroyed the organization. It was like, oh, so you're a crime syndicate, it would appear. And the organization went away. Now, it probably got reconstituted and everybody involved scattered to other things like cockroaches, but it actually went away. Did any of the journals that you basically punked into oblivion go away or change as a result of what?
Nope. And even if we didn't get busted by the Wall Street Journal and we got 20 of those papers, we write those, it still wouldn't have made a difference. I think I was very Pollyanna in my thinking about it. The system is too entrenched. There are too many ideologues, too many people who have tenure, who have jobs for life. They have absolutely no interest in veering from course. The entire system is an ideology mill. It's purely designed to replicate the dominant ideology.
As we get deeper into our conversation, I want to hit on some of the things that you've written about and you're doing. It seems like so much of your work is about trying to understand how do we come to believe what we believe and how do we functionally challenge what we believe. And that's such a powerful, is that a fair characterization?
That is absolutely fair. I was just thinking you did your homework.
Why, in the most steelman way, in one sense, I think what you guys did is really kind of noble, not just for exposing something, but you had to do enough homework to think and speak in the voice of these people who you obviously find to be like reprehensible.
Totally abhorrent.
And, and so that's actually really great. Like that's sort of what we have to be doing. Why are they not interested in doing the same? Like there's an asymmetry there. Like why wouldn't you, if you call yourself an academic enterprise, why would you not take seriously what you've laid down? Like,
because
I just like Richard Feynman. So many people come to mind who care about the nature of science and thought.
Yeah, the easiest person to fool is yourself.
So base.
Yeah, you thinking of the Feynman, the easiest person to fool is yourself. Yeah, so the reason can be summed up in one sentence. If you think you possess the truth, you do not seek it. Now, the mechanism for that's a longer explanation, but they think they found the truth. They have what Brazilian educator Paulo Freire says, a critical consciousness. So, for example, it's not if racism occurred in any given situation, it's how it occurred. So you develop a critical consciousness, which is the ability to spot systems of oppression everywhere, because we know the whole system is patriarchal and racist and oppressive and cis heteronormative. And so we need to develop these tools to enable us to identify and then dismantle the system. So it's the institutions, our academies are not truth-oriented. Their purpose is to give students tools to help them detect, understand, and then remediate oppression. That's the purpose. So you're thinking about it, your lens is a truth-seeking lens. Their lens is not a truth-seeking lens. That's why diversity, equity, and inclusion, those things perfectly make sense once you understand the critical consciousness, once you understand the purpose of the institution is not to find truth. The purpose of the institution is to give people this consciousness so then they can go out and remake society.
So this is a good, I think, way to segue into what's Harvard as the modern recent case study of all of this coming to a head, because it's the oldest, if I remember this correctly, it's the oldest university in America, isn't it, Harvard?
Yes. But we didn't talk. Can I just pause you one sec before you go down that? Because that's a huge rabbit hole. We need one more piece to really understand this. And here's the piece. Michael Shermer wrote a book, Why People Believe Weird Things. One of the chapters in that book is why smart people believe weird things. Smart people believe weird things because they're better at rationalizing. Rationalizing is not reasoning to. It's coming up with good reasons for bad conclusions. I published a piece in the Philosopher's magazine called Deluded Departments, which, by the way, my colleagues lost their minds about. And the idea behind the piece was that if you get groups of really smart people together, they become better at rationalizing. They become the mouthpieces of the dominant orthodoxy. So this happens in academia precisely because you get people who are, some of these people are, I don't want to, how can I, they're midwits, to be blunt. So they're not smart. In fact, they're very mediocre intellects, but you get some people who are just smarter than the average, and collectively they work together. Groups of smarter people are better at coming up with good reasons for bad conclusions. And then that becomes embedded in the structure of the institution. So that's one of the reasons that this is taking off. And so the gatekeepers of reason have all fallen. There's nothing, this is purely ideological. Purely.
What I'm hearing is something, it rhymes with Jonathan Haidt's model of the elephant and the rider.
Right.
And this idea that our moral intuitions tend to come from an intuitive sense, this our gut, so to speak, and that's the elephant, this big beast that's sort of lumbering through the world on, on its own. And then our rational minds rest atop it like a little rider, serving as a ex post rationalization.
Correct.
The elephant wanted to go through this part of the jungle, and the little rational guy that pretends to be steering it is really just there like a rationalizing PR department to describe the explanations. Oh, well, we went this way because this was a shorter route. And well, technically it wasn't shorter, but it is shorter because if we went that way, we would have X, Y, and Z. And, that book came out years ago, but it left a pretty profound impact on me because it raises the question of how any kind of knowledge progress can happen in human society at all if we're all just elephants sort of looking to confirm our biases and then use our rational minds to sort of justify our nonsense. Like, how do I have this piece of technology here? How are we taught? Like, how do you understand how progress has happened if that is the nature of humans and the nature of when smart humans get together? It like kind of poses a Gordian knot, doesn't it?
Yeah. So there's a great little piece in the book, The Epistemology of Democracy, and the piece is about my side bias. So my side bias is a kind of tribalism. Oh, my side's right. My religion is right. My belief system is right. Everybody else is not merely wrong, but they're bad people. So if you believe certain things, it's not merely that you're lacking, like Plato says in the Theaetetus, it's not merely that you're lacking a piece of information. It's an entirely different move. It's kind of a Nietzschean move from we don't have enough information to you're a bad person for believing this. So my side bias is the most difficult thing to overcome. It's the most, how do you get people to break through to that tribalism? Like, how do you get them to even honestly evaluate information? That's where street epistemology comes in, which is another conversation. So how did we get here now? We can still have, it's called instrumental rationality. We can still have the telos, or the end of certain means of production in our technological infrastructure. Like, we can create phones, there's a market mechanism for that. We can create cameras, we can create lights, we can create all these things, but that is only in one very specific domain. And that domain is the technological domain. There are no relativists at 50,000 feet in the air when they're flying in a plane. It's all verbal behavior. It's all nonsense. Nobody is talking about a social construct when they go into the bank and the guy that they want to change $100 and they give him $8 in change in singles. And then nobody's saying, well, that's just your reality. So this is all just verbal behavior. Nobody actually believes. Nobody, when their kids get sick, nobody will take their kids, well, virtually nobody in the West, all the people who are clamoring on about relativism and they're clamoring on about patriarchy, et cetera, when their kids get sick, they're not taking them to the female witch doctor.
It feels like maybe one of the things that's happening here is this difference between what's the so-called hard sciences and the soft sciences or the social sciences? Is that part of why that works? So, hey, if whether or not this medicine actually alleviates the underlying condition is something we can measure, but that's not even on the hardest side. So the hardest side would be, oh, how do sound waves move into this microphone and then get recorded onto some magnetic digital device? And we can write that out on paper, and then we can see if that works. And that's called physics and engineering. And that's hard science. Some work close to that, but more in the middle is like, oh, does this medicine work? That's still soft. That's kind of softer. The body's complicated. And then there's um, the outcomes we see in America are the product of systemic racism. And that's on the other side of the spectrum, because it's like, well, we can't really test that really at all, and it's all soft and complicated, and how would you falsify it? Is that what's going on?
Somewhat. So with the microphone, it's less likely that there's ideological static injected in the system, right? So you're just trying to figure something out. Now, what's interesting is that there are exceptions even to that. So, for example, the way that you study, the people you select to study themselves could be ideologically captured. So, for example, we want diversity statements from people. So, or we want, now I know that that link might seem tenuous, but I'll make it. Anytime you take any characteristic other than merit into account, then you compromise the objective of what you're trying to do. So, for example, a great illustration of this is professional sports teams. Anytime you take, for example, race into account in professional sports teams, or sexual orientation, you're compromising the goal of actually winning. So even the phenomenon like the microphone that we study is itself subject to ways of studying it. Now, I know that must sound like postmodern claptrap, but it's actually quite true. So you go from that. I mean, look, you can think about it like medicine. Do you remember? You obviously know the word. You know the word triage, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Sorry about that. I just So do you remember in the pandemic they were talking about triaging who gets vaccinations based on race? So, for example, people with a lot of historical oppression markers, they're going to get the vaccination first, and then white men will get the vaccination last. So even within those systems, you can inject ideological bias. Or we talked about psychology, which is on the other end from the microphones, it's softer science, but those things themselves, I mean, that's what validity is. That's what replication is. We can replicate a study to see if the conditions we created improve treatment modalities, improve outcomes. And if we can't do that, if those can't be replicated, then it's a massive question mark about whether clinicians should use them in the first place. But what you study is itself determined by the ideologies of the people who go into it. I mean, this is the one thing that nobody can talk about, but I'll throw it out there. Like race and IQ would be an example. There's a truth of the matter to be had. People won't touch it with a 10-foot pole, and when they do, the cost for them studying it is way up, like Charles Murray. The cost for them studying it, or even Sam Harris, who interviewed Charles Murray in that now infamous podcast. Even having people on. So there's multiple levels of ideology that are operative in any system. They're operative in the hard sciences, soft sciences. But yes, to answer your question, I hope that wasn't too long-winded, the more you go toward your right, away from the microphone and hard technology, the more you traverse that distance, the more ideology will play a role. But that doesn't mean that ideology doesn't play a role in any other part of the inquiry. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does, and I think it tracks with it, but it also, to some extent, it suggests a kind of underlying fundamental challenge, which has been, it seems like, exploited, which is that the more we have complexity and uncertainty, the more likely it is for us to sort of become baseline ideology and tribe oriented in the way we confront a challenge. So one like this is expressed in an interesting place, which is you have Silicon Valley firms comprised of engineers who've also like gone all in culturally internally on identity politics. So like identity politics doesn't help you make video compression algorithms work better over the internet. It plays no role in that. And yet for some reason these two things can exist within the same person, that they can be working on the next video compression for YouTube and know what that is like to
Right.
do and to see improvement. Like, oh, if I tweak this, wow, it's the file's smaller. Okay. Like, hypothesis, test, see the result. Oh, it worked, it didn't work. And yet hold within them that, well, no, that domain is that, but over here is this other way of being. And I guess we confront this stuff all the time, right? And we confront it as students when we decide what we want to study or where our passions are. And I feel like that's the part is it that we can't have, like, how do we start to bend the social sciences and the soft stuff back to an honest pursuit? Or is it actually baked into the cake that it can't be an honest pursuit? I guess that's my question. Is it sort of a doomed enterprise?
Yeah, it's a great question. The answer is yes and no. The solution is obvious, and I'm hesitant to say easy, but it kind of is easy. So the first order of business is everything we're really talking about here can be boiled down to a disposition. We're talking about certain dispositions that people have to adopt when they inquire into how the world works, right? So for example, with creationism, the idea is you want to say, oh, well, geez, well, how old is the Earth? Is the Earth closer to 10,000 years, or how old is the universe? Is it closer to 1 billion years or 1,000? Like, how do we do this? And what we do is we then look to the epistemic landscape. In other words, we look to the information and data that we have, and then we are honest with ourselves and we put a picture together. Now, the key word in that sentence is honest, right? So we're honest with ourselves, but what we don't do is we don't start with the conclusion first and work backward. So we don't start with the fact that the Earth is 10,000 years old. We're going to look to our epistemic landscape and only pull in data that supports the conclusion, because we know the conclusion must be right, and anything else we'll just chuck as anomalous or offensive or ridiculous or a higher error rate or what have you. That's not how honest inquirers look. But what's interesting about that is, I'm assuming you and I can look at that example and say, well, duh, that's obvious. But the exact phenomenon is taking place in parallel in our institutions with questions of systemic racism, for example. Like, we know there are disparities. So this is Ibram Kendi's thing. Every disparity in outcome is due to systems. Okay, that's just insane. I mean, it's completely insane. But okay, let's run with it. So if you believe that every disparity in outcome is due to systems, then all you would need to do, because that's the truth, like that's apodictic. You're starting with that truth and you're working backward to it. The problem is that most people do that in most things in their life. And I would say virtually everybody does it sometimes. The thing that I cannot understand, that I've been doing this for so long, reading, thinking, and writing about this, I cannot understand why some people have an apparent immunity to these things. I have not been able to figure that out yet. And that's not explained merely by disposition. Like, if you have a disposition to revise your belief, that's a huge one, by the way. Like, the willingness and the ability to revise what you believe. In other words, to change your mind. If you are genuinely honest with yourself and you want to find truth, and you'll be willing to consider things that you might find offensive. If you have those dispositions, so one of the things that's running through my head in this is, I have 2 kids and they're both gay, right? So my kids are wonderful kids. I love them to death. They're my whole life. Love them to death. But that being said, would I change my mind about gay marriage? I'm pro-gay marriage. If I looked at the data and I saw that the data that was rigorous and robust and fairly compiled, and it was cross-cultural, and it said that, you know, homosexual marriage has all these bad outcomes on kids. Would I change my mind about policies on gay marriage? Like, that would be an example of a belief in which the evidence and data contradict the moral impulses that we have. In every single case, and to be clear, I'm very much pro-gay marriage, because I don't think that data exists. But I have to be open to the possibility of revising my belief if data comes in. In fact, that's what it means to formulate a belief on the basis of evidence. To formulate a belief on the basis of evidence means, by definition, that there has to be some evidence that comes in that causes you to rethink what it is that you believe. Now, if you say, well, I'm not going to change my belief no matter what, there is no evidence. Okay, great, wonderful. That means that your belief is not formulated on the basis of evidence. It's formulated on the basis of something else. Because if it were formulated on the basis of evidence, you'd be willing to change it if new evidence came in. But if you're not willing to change it, that means it's not formulated on the basis of evidence. So what's it formulated on? Does that make sense?
So it does. So I mean, I think at some level, if I can just play back my understanding of what you're saying, is that the path is cut straight through humility and curiosity. That if you want to be someone who has any level of confidence that your ideas are true, you need to do that by way of first saying, I don't know what the truth is, and I have to be curious enough to ask questions and be willing to let the answers surprise me.
That's part of it, yes. The other part is you have to have, again, a disposition, and this is in the American Philosophical Association's Delphi Report, 1990-1991. You need to have a disposition to seek out relevant information. Like, you have to seek out in philosophy what are called defeaters, or conditions under which your beliefs could be false. Like, you have to have a kind of propensity, that intellectual curiosity has to manifest itself in such a way that you actively go out looking for reasons for why your beliefs could be false. And literally nobody does that. I mean, that's just not the way we're wired. That takes a truly incredible amount of work. And you need a kind of, I don't know, you need a kind of like super disposition to do that, because we all navigate life. We're busy, we're working, we got jobs, we got obligations, how on earth are we going to go out and seek out defeaters for some beliefs that make it easy for us to navigate reality?
Yeah, that does seem like a big part of so much of why we are the way we are. That if you just think about like the amount of information that comes into your eyes, just the picture at any given moment, you're having to filter out almost all of it in order to make some notion of a thought. Like, I'm looking at you through this camera situation, but I'm trying to just look at you and hear your voice and not pay attention to anything else. I have to ignore, if I took this as like a screen that within my peripheral vision, I'm probably only focusing on 5% of the information in order to so that's like a values choice fundamentally, isn't it? In a certain sense.
You mean what you choose to focus on?
Yeah, I think like we are always having to prioritize in a world of mass amounts of information. And so taking shortcuts is the only way that we can actually navigate the world. Otherwise, it's like everywhere you go, you don't know you don't even know how to take a step next. Like, it's like when I'm walking down the street in New York City, people that come into the city who aren't accustomed to being in New York find it to be a kind of rude experience, because there's a lot of people not looking you in the eye as they walk down the street. But the reality is, it's the only way you can navigate that city. If you look at every person's face, you won't walk 5 feet. You will be stuck. And so, how much is this also an example of
okay,
wiring that maybe we need in order to navigate the world, but it kind of breaks when it comes to ideas?
Okay, this is super important. So, yes, and That's from improv comedy. I wrote about that in my book. Yes, anding instead of no, but, or no, or yes, but. Yes, and we need to figure out how to make discerning judgments about what we're going to spend our time on in terms of, oh, I want to figure out if this belief is likely to be false. Notice I didn't say likely to be true. Or yes, I want to figure out if this, I want to look and to try to figure things out. But that ties back to the first thing you said about humility. If you don't have the time or you don't have the inclination to seek out certain propositions, certain beliefs that you hold, if you don't have the time to try to falsify those or try to look to data for those, the thing you ought to do is decrease your confidence in those beliefs. You ought to be more epistemically humble about the things that you believe. You ought to hold those beliefs with less tenacity and less conviction. Even the word conviction itself is a problem. Like in society, oh, he's a man of conviction. Every time I hear he's a man of conviction, that to me translates into, oh, he's a man who will not change his beliefs on the basis of evidence. Right? You see the switch from epistemological to moral?
Can you, for the benefit of me, actually, epistemological, what does that mean?
Epistemology is how you know what you think you know. It's just the study of knowledge. And morality is basically what you ought to do.
You, I want to transition us to what you're doing with your street epistemology.
Yeah.
But before I do, you left your university in a very open way, and it's obviously tied to all of this because
Right.
You decided. Well, why did you do it? Why did you leave Portland State University?
I left because it became literally impossible to do what they hired me to do, which was to teach. My primary area was teaching critical thinking. That was my publication record. That's why they hired me. I taught a number of classes. That was a big class. I had a class of 120. It became impossible to teach that because the university was governed by ideology as opposed to teaching people what is the other side of the issue. How do you think clearly about things? They had very prescribed narratives of things you couldn't say. You get brought up on charges if you didn't say the right thing, or if you said something else, or it was an increasingly deranged and toxic environment. It wasn't merely that I was doing myself a disservice and couldn't teach. It was that the students were being harmed by it. They were actually being harmed. It was doing an injustice towards the students. That's ultimately why I had to quit. And I remember I walked into the dean's office. So the president, I tried so hard to get him to meet with me for 5 minutes. I sent him repeated emails, and his office told me he was too busy. I wanted 5 minutes. He wouldn't give it to me. So I got to a dean, and I told the dean, and I was acutely aware that I had to stick to the 5 minutes. I told the dean that I was genuinely bothered that we made Greg Lukianoff's FIRE, at the time it was, I think, Foundation for Individual Rights in Education, that Portland State University made, I can't remember what it was, like the top 10 or something. It made some list of worst schools for free speech. And I told him that I was disturbed by this and we needed to take steps to change this. And he said, without any sense of irony, sometimes it's a good thing to be on those lists. And it totally blew my mind. It blew my mind because this was not a bug of the system. This is a feature. It's a feature to limit speech. This is not like everybody's in some ideological powwow. This is that you ought not to say certain things. You ought not to question certain conclusions. And it's good to not question your beliefs. It's good to not question these values.
So I think we could probably spend 5 hours talking about how the universities have abandoned the pursuit of truth.
Right.
So it seems to me like the world that you have left from a university perspective has now come to high school and middle school in part through this debate mechanism. What's your understanding of that and how that's happened?
I'm exasperated and I'm frustrated. And I've been screaming about this stuff from 2012 and nobody listened. You know, it was Boghossian's a nutcase. He's a crank. He's a weirdo. To, okay, this is fringe departments in fringe universities. What's the issue? To, okay, these are some fringe departments, not really in the humanities. To, okay, it's the humanities. To, okay, it's the university system. To, it is ubiquitous in the society. It's just critical social justice, wokeism, whatever you want to call it. We know the nucleation point. We know it comes from the universities. We have a pretty good idea of how to stop it. Nobody listened. Nobody thought it would seep out. And now look at the utterly devastating consequence. Debate is just one manifestation of the ideology. There is complete and total ideological capture of our institutions. And by the way, that's why nobody trusts our institutions.
Well, and you know, the mechanism of debate. Um, why is the mechanism of debate in a not just why is the mechanism of debate the antidote to this worldview?
I don't think it is the antidote. I think it's an antidote. I don't think there's one silver bullet that's going to get us out of this self-imposed catastrophe. So you need a kind of a dialectic, right? You need a kind of something that's pushing back on your ideas. The best way to think about that is a corrective mechanism. You have to have a corrective mechanism in your cognitions to help you figure out what's true and what's not true. So here's another way we can tie this whole thing in together. The closer an activity is to reality, the more difficult it is to be faked. The farther it is from reality, the easier it is to fake. Speaking a foreign language cannot be faked. Playing an instrument, a musical instrument, cannot be faked. Doing jujitsu cannot be faked. Gender studies can be faked. Writing fake papers, that you can do that because there's no corrective mechanism there. There's no way to show that the things that you're writing about can be falsified or aren't true because you're forwarding narratives. So it's absent a corrective mechanism. Now bring that back to debate. So debate affords you an opportunity to have a corrective mechanism in your cognitions. It affords you a way to think precisely and clearly, to make arguments to rebut things that you may not have believed, or you may not. It's an opportunity to make your ideas clear. It's a way to cut through the noise.
What is it about steel manning another perspective, the one that you don't hold? Like, why is that important, and what actually happens? Because that's a big part of what you do in your street epistemology. Why is that such an important ethic and practice?
Yeah, steel manning is vital. I'd almost go so far as to say that it's indispensable if you want to help people communicate across a divide. Part of the reason is, there are many reasons. Part of the reason is, I believe that it's incumbent upon us to make better arguments than the people who believe things that are antithetical to what we believe. Often these people, specifically in the case of wokeism or critical social justice, these are just extraordinarily mediocre minds. They happen to have latched on to ideas. So it's not like you need to give this expression a hermeneutic of charity, like a charitable interpretation. You don't need to do that at all. You just need to figure out, if they can't make, or more often than not, are unwilling to make arguments for why their positions are true, you should do it for them. In fact, it's incumbent upon you, it's morally incumbent upon you to make better arguments than they can for the positions that they ostensibly claim to hold. And the reason that the reason that that's important is that if you're really trying to figure out what's true, you need to look at beliefs and ideas that are different from your own. And you need to figure out, that's the word epistemology again. Why would someone believe this? Why would a rational, sane, thoughtful person think that this is true? Let me give you an example. we were in London and we were talking to people about the Israeli-Palestinian situation. And one thing that we did so we write claims on the board, and then we have mats that people stand on: strongly agree, slightly agree, neutral, and then on the other side. And one of the claims that we had was the two-state solution is the best solution. And we had one person walk to strongly agree, one person walk to strongly disagree. We give them whiteboards and they write down the best reason they have for believing that. They had absolutely no clue whatsoever why someone would think that that's good or why someone would think that that's bad. So in these conversations, and particularly in debate, we get caught up in the conclusions. But what we should be doing is looking at the reasons that one holds. Why does somebody believe this? And is there reason, sufficient justification to warrant confidence at that level? So is their confidence calibrated correctly to the evidence? More often than not, the answer is no. People will inflate their confidence beyond the warrant of the evidence. That's a problem. That's why we steel man. We steel man to see if we can figure out, okay, why would someone believe this? Here's what they believe. Is this sufficient reason to justify somebody believing that? Because if you don't do that, then you don't have a corrective mechanism. You don't have a way to correct your beliefs and your cognitions. It has to be something external to the system that comes in, a dialectic that causes you to challenge. Debate affords people an opportunity to do that. It affords people a way to make their ideas clear.
What happens? You've been doing these street experiments, if that's the right term, the experiences. They're like an experience and an experiment, um, with hundreds of people now. And what happens when you are forced to try to make the best possible, best faith argument for the thing you disagree with? What happens to your mind? What happens to you as a person?
Okay, so let me contextualize that. So if one person stands on the strongly agree and one person stands on the strongly disagree, then we have them write down their reasons, their best reason for believing that, and the other person guesses it. However, if everybody stands on the strongly agree or everybody stands on the strongly disagree, then I flip a coin and I ask the first person there, I'll say heads or tails, call in the air. If it's heads and they get it, I say, okay, you have a choice. You can go to Steelman or someone else can go to Steelman. And that is also interesting to see if they want a Steelman or if they want someone else to Steelman. I think that's fascinating. Okay, so let's say that somebody goes there. Many people have trouble Steelmanning positions. And the reason for that is they've simply never thought about why someone would think that this is a good idea. They've only thought in terms of conclusions, but you have to think in terms of reasons for the conclusions. That's the linchpin in this whole thing. Why would someone think this is a good idea? And asking them to steelman opens up a little wedge, opens up an opportunity for them to think about an issue in a way that they would not ordinarily have thought about it.
I feel like you're in the best position of anybody I've talked to help me with this, which is what would be the reason why you would commit yourself as a person that wants to make the world a better place to attacking the discovery process itself,
Oh, that's
attacking
easy.
debate itself,
That's easy.
without just being like a mustache twirling villain, like
No.
to say no,
I'll steelman it.
there is.
Yeah, no, that's easy. It's easy to steelman. No problem. Easy to steelman. So the answer can be found in Aubrey Lord, the Black lesbian writer. The master's tools cannot dissemble the master's house. The master's tools cannot disable the master's house. What is the master's house? Patriarchy, racism, oppression, discrimination, systemic discrimination, violence. Reason, rationality, epistemic adequacy, all of these things are responsible for building the master's house. They're the support. If you look at it as an architectonic structure, these are the support beams for the house. The master's tools cannot dissemble or disable the master's house. You can't use reason and rationality and dialogue and debate and discourse to remove extant power structures of systemic racism and oppression. You cannot, those are not the right tools, because those are the tools that got us in the problem in the first place. So you have to use other tools. You have to rip down statues. You have to defund the police, because the moment you defund the police are the main things between the capitalist structure and the people. If you defund the police, which they believe is racist and oppressive and fundamentally patriarchal, if you defund the police, then you can undermine the system. But you don't undermine the system through democratic means. Liberalism isn't the way to undermine the system. You have to undermine the system through power. Antifa knows this.
So that, I've heard that phrase, this, this master's house with the master's tool phrase. The first thing I don't understand about that is it's a terrible analogy. I mean, the tools you use to dismantle a house are the same tools you use to build the house.
Okay, but there you go again.
Hammers and saws and trucks and so
Okay, there you go.
Better.
Okay, so I just said to you what Reagan said to Walter Mondale. There you go again. There you go again. You're again using the very tools to attempt to analyze how to rip down the master's house. So you committed it's not even a fallacy. You are participating in a form of oppression. The very fact that you did that.
So is it about, I am struggling even to participate here and figure out how you answer that question.
Well,
because it seems like
that's
that
right.
question.
You don't answer it through dialogue. You don't answer it through debate. You don't answer it through discourse. You can answer it non-verbally by beating up white people or by raising your fists in the air. You can answer it by overthrowing certain patriarchal, racist, and you can overthrow it through diversity, equity, and inclusion boards that works within the system. You can overthrow it through replacing equality of opportunity with equity. You can overthrow it by inclusion. Inclusion is one of the best ways to overthrow it. And that's one of the things. Most people don't understand the definition of the word inclusion. Every term in the critical social justice lexicon has two meanings. This is called Mott and Bailey. It has a defensible term that they retreat to, and then it has the indefensible term, the Bailey, that is used to smuggle its way into public policy. Every term. Inclusion is the perfect example of this. If I say to people, if I just pluck a random person off the street and say, hey man, what do you think of inclusion? Is that a good idea? They'll be like, of course it's a good idea. Who doesn't want to include people? We want to include everybody. We want to include people who are gay. We want to include, fat people, tall people, skinny people. We want to include white people, black people, of course, Native Americans. Everybody should be included. I totally agree. Yeah, every sane person would think, yeah, sure, people need to be included. That's the Mott. But the Bailey is something different. Here's the Bailey of inclusion, and when you hear people who participate in the ideology, this is what they mean by inclusion. Inclusion, an inclusive space is we want everybody to feel included. Now, what does included mean? It means we want them to feel welcome. Well, how do they feel welcome? Well, they feel welcome if they don't feel offended, because if they feel offended, then by definition, they're not feeling welcome. So in order for them to not be offended, we have to restrict speech. Then no one will feel offended. So an inclusive space restricts speech. So again, it's the targeting of speech. The targeting of speech is essential to the success of critical social justice. It is indispensable. They have to restrict speech because speech, they believe, was one of the tools that caused oppression in the first place.
the language of safe spaces and of safety, that seems like it's exactly what you're speaking to. So many of these debates, they will sort of break down around the fact that an argument creates, it makes the debate space unsafe.
Yeah, so that's
And is
a very recent phenomenon. It's called safetyism. That's a very recent phenomenon. We've moved from physical safety to kind of being safe from ideas or being safe from certain concepts which they believe will cause harm. They're a form of epistemic violence. There are lines in the literature about epistemic violence. I know it's a lot to take
I'm
in.
lost for words a little bit in
Yeah.
trying to stay in a zone that takes this seriously, because the first part of our conversation is about what is the pursuit of truth, and that it is fundamentally uncomfortable. And it seems like it has to be, because if I believe a thing that's false, it's really uncomfortable to be confronted with that.
Yeah, okay, so you're thinking about it the wrong way, if I may. I don't mean to be rude. You're thinking about it the
No,
wrong way.
yeah.
Yeah, so you and I are thinking about it in terms of figuring out what's true. You and I are thinking about, okay, so how do we know what's true? Well, science, reason, debate, conversation, these are ways we figure out what's true. Truth is our North Star. The people who participate in critical social justice ideology don't believe in truth. Now, they believe that truth is mediated through power relations. So in any society, it's not that they don't believe that there's an external world or that if you walk across the street, you're not going to get hit by a car. That's not what we're talking about. They believe that the very act of figuring out what's true is mediated through power relations. Foucault talks about this. In fact, Foucault has one word, power knowledge. They're not interested in what's true. They're interested in power. They're interested in dissembling systems. Truth to you and me, that's, we frame things, we think, again, it's the North Star. They're not thinking in terms of truth. They're thinking in terms of power. They're thinking in terms of there are oppressive systems, we need to destroy them. So you have to switch the way you think about it and stop thinking about truth.
How is this, and how is this anything other than might makes right? How is that framework not might makes right?
So again, I'm going to steelman this, okay? So it is not might makes right because the people we are taking away the might from are the people who are the oppressors. They're the white people. They're the people who have kept the patriarchy in power. They are misogynists. So we're helping the underdog. We're helping vulnerable people. We're helping marginalized communities. And this manifests in every way from environmental racism to systemic discrimination to equity-based initiatives.
As you've engaged people, and where have you found that you can actually take someone who has rewired their brain to be seeing the world through this lens, and start to reconnect to truth as a North Star, the pursuit of truth as a North Star, and not the pursuit of power and oppressor oppressed structures that I guess are permanent and came from somewhere else, or whatever they're, wherever they think this is coming from. It's because it's all presupposed that there's these hierarchies of power that already exist that will somehow, I can fight against, but maybe they'll always be there. But how do you, where have you seen someone say, like extract themselves from that? What was the lifeline that you have seen works? Or maybe there's not one, but
Yeah, that's a great question. So in one sense, you're asking if there's an intervention. Is there a way to intervene in people's cognitions? Now, that can be taken from 30,000 feet up. Like, is there a societal or social or even civilizational intervention through television, or comedy is a big one? Andrew Doyle has some great stuff on this. Or is there intervention at the one-on-one level, the micro level? So
let's stay at the micro level.
Okay, so spectrum street epistemology is that intervention. Spectrum street epistemology is a way to help people align the confidence in their beliefs with the reason they have for the beliefs. So rewinding the conversation. So I developed the proto model of this when I taught in prisons. And I took that and then I applied it to faith-based epistemologies, faith-based belief systems. And I took that and I mapped that onto, it's kind of a topographical mapping, how to have conversations across divides. And now we've taken this in terms of the spectrum street epistemology. It is a way to help people understand the degree to which they are influenced by ideology. It's also a way to give people the gift of doubt, how to help them doubt the things that they believe, how to help them be more humble about what it is that they think that they know.
It feels like we're at a moment where the question about what civilization is has come to the foreground in public discourse in a big way, or at least in this intellectual discourse in the podcast world and academic world. And I think it's broken through with the Claudine Gay and the aftermath of 10/7 quite a bit. So I feel like it's not just super esoteric nerd talk. But I mean, how do you think about what civilization is, and how it survives? Like because it does feel like the things we're talking about are so basic, like how to know what you know, how to advance knowledge. And I don't see how you can have like modern civilization if you give up on the tool set that creates knowledge. Like, how do you
Correct.
How do you think about that?
Yeah, as Florence Reed from Unheard says, we are living in a uniquely stupid age. This is a uniquely idiotic age. So I think about civilization. I think about what Thomas Sowell said about civilization, this idea that conservatives want to conserve the civilization. They want to conserve elements of the society that enable people to flourish, that help people to live the kind of lives they want. So right now, society is simultaneously, the citizens in not only the West, this is a neo-colonial export, critical social justice, that we've exported all around the world. Great book on that was Rajiv Malhotra's Snakes in the Ganga, where he talks about America exporting not values of a shining city upon a hill, but values of pronouns and trans status. People are born in the wrong body and everything is due to systems. Okay. So what does it mean to conserve society? And is there anything worth conserving? Well, the first order of business is you have to have some fundamental starting points. You have to have some first principles. We have a really good, in the United States, we're very fortunate, we have basic freedoms, freedom of assembly, freedom of the press, freedom of speech. But increasingly, those are under attack. I think since I've started this journey, one of the things that I've learned is the most fundamental and perhaps important freedom is cognitive liberty. You're Catholic, I'm an atheist. It is absolutely vital that you have the right to believe what you want to believe about, the transubstantiation or whatever it is that you want to believe. In the same way that we shouldn't have...
It's a good deep cut. I appreciate it.
Yeah.
Transubstantiation.
Well, I don't know what my first thought was Jesus walking on water, but okay. So,
yeah. Even better, that a piece of bread becomes the actual body and blood.
Yeah, well, that's why I thought
Messiah.
of it, because it's the most crazy thing I could think of. But
it's a crazy sounding thing.
Yeah, not just sounding. But anyway, so even in that right there, which was important, is that, and this is one of the things we've lost. Like, I gave you a little dig, you took it in a good way. Nobody's ending their friendship. Nobody's like storming out of here. Like, that should be, we all have to live together in a society, right? We all have to get along with each other. And, we know each other a little bit. So I can rib you about that, or you can rib me about, I don't have enough faith to be an atheist, or, whatever it is. But I don't take these things personally. But we have taught generations of kids now that being offended is a virtue, that you should be offended, that if you're not offended, that you're a bad person. It's a kind of virtue signaling, and it's virtue signaling by proxy. I'm offended that you've said something to him, even though he's not offended. I'm offended on behalf of him. No, we got to let this whole offended thing go. It's just, this is a civilizational toxin because that prevents discourse and dialogue. But again, the problem is we have people running around who simply don't believe in discourse and dialogue. We have people who are actively fighting against our institutions and the ability for us to retain our speech rights, our cognitive liberties, our freedom of assembly, our freedom of press, even our Miranda rights, oddly enough. So the question is, what does it mean to be in a civilization? My answer to that question would be to uphold the liberties that all of us are afforded. And in order to do that, we have to have some basic consensus on how we should behave in the public square, how we should live our lives. In Portland, I moved out of Portland, they ripped down the Abraham Lincoln statue.
Well, because of course.
Well, yeah, I mean, it was also, a lot of this is we have a bunch of thugs terrorizing our institutions, and they have their intellectual horsepower from people in the academies. But the larger problem is we're in a situation now where cowardice is rampant. I mean, we have the mutilation of the genitals of children. We know from Schellenberger's W path. We know from the Tavistock. We know from the wonderful stuff Andrew Doyle's done, the coverage. We know from Bernard Lane in Australia, his stuff. We know that this is grotesque. We know that this is not evidence-based. We know that. And now even countries in Northern Europe are starting to ban these procedures. But we have had an epidemic of cowardice. People were cowardly. They didn't speak up. Children who suffered from gender dysmorphia, children who are now lifelong medical patients. So what does it mean to have a civilization? Is you have to have people in the civilization who think it's worth fighting for and who stand up for things and take hits, because you will take hits. You'll take hits on social media. You'll take hits from your friends. I can't tell you how many friends I've lost. You have to get beyond the epidemic of cowardice. You have to not be a coward. You have to stand up and fight when something is clearly false. However, you also have to couple that with one disposition: the ability to change your mind, the ability to revise your belief if incoming evidence shows that you were incorrect. And that's the piece that is missing. That is the piece that is missing from the ideologues in their ideological tool set. They do not have the willingness or the ability to change their minds. They're very good at calling everybody a Nazi and a racist and a bigot and a homophobe, when the great irony is that they were almost universally homophobe. The percentage of these young kids who are quote unquote transition was itself a myth. The majority of those kids are autistic or gay. Abigail Schreier's written about that. Colin Wright has written about that.
Yeah, it's basically surgical transition. It's surgical
mutilation.
What's the term? What's the term that was used for the? It's surgical conversion therapy. Which is what the Iranians do. Yeah,
that's absolutely correct. And we have had an epidemic of cowardice, of people failing to stand up.
So I want to pose a challenge to you.
Sure.
In the spirit of this, which is that, and when I was talking, our mutual friends Brett and Heather came on the show, and we had a moment about faith. I brought up that I've become increasingly, attached and interested in my Catholic heritage and the Catholic sort of belief system. And I'm not claiming to be an expert. I'm not Bishop Barron. I basically turned to him and his YouTube channel to learn about this stuff. But one of the things that seems to be true is that the courage to stand up for these principles, the underlying rationale for I think what some of these principles rely on, which is a basic level of equal dignity. It's not perfect human equality, but a basic level of shared dignity that is equal. That these things are an inheritance of essentially the, you know, the faith tradition, and I'll just say the Christian faith tradition and roll the sort of Jewish underpinnings of that into that. I'm not saying that Islam doesn't have any of that. I don't know enough about Islam, and I'm not prepared to be some anti-Islam guy just because I don't know enough about it. But I'll just speak to this. Richard Dawkins recently said that he, and this has been floating around on Twitter like recently, that he's culturally Christian, which is kind of an amazing thing for Richard Dawkins to say. And it just strikes me that we are at a moment where the hope of the new atheists has of some kind of move towards a kind of like a pure rationalism seems like a failed enterprise, and that we've gotten instead as a void filled by new fake religions that whose metaphysics are at odds with reality in ways that, frankly, the Christian faith is not at odds with reality, because it basically says, look, there's this other plane, and it's not at odds with reality. It doesn't, you can't prove it in the ways that would be scientific, and that, for I imagine for you, that's enough to be like, well, why do I want to believe that nonsense? But it's not at odds with reality. And so I'd rather have a religion whose norms and whose presuppositions support civilization, support human dignity, than remove that and let some cancerous growth come in that's at direct odds with reality and is trying to rip it apart from the seams. And I'm sorry to like kind of go off on a tangent here, but do you feel that has that, I know you've written about trying to write persuasively on behalf of atheism. Has that been an area where you've been like, maybe that's not strategically sound, and by virtue of that, maybe wrong?
Boy, there's so much there. First of all, I want to take the Richard. So Dawkins has said that before, that he's culturally Christian, but it just happens to be going around now. I believe he writes about that in The God Delusion as well. So that's not a new thing. The dignity piece is very interesting. The people who are in the camp of critical social justice, they both believe broadly in dignity, but they believe in an equity-based dignity. In other words, we need to, people who have historical oppression markers, for example, through race, they should be afforded more dignity than people who do not have those historical oppression markers. In fact, we can even give them dignity at the expense of the people who have traditionally and historically been on the top of that social pyramid. Okay, now
it's a zero-sum formulation of dignity in some
correct.
In some respects.
That's correct. In fact, it's even worse than that in some sense, but basically you can distill it down to that. Okay, so what you just asked is what I call the substitution hypothesis. And I interviewed Richard about this. I've interviewed many people about this. The substitution hypothesis is the idea, I think it's best to explain through Game of Thrones. Have you seen Game of Thrones?
Yeah.
Okay, good. You're not dead to me. So that as old religions decrease, belief in old religions decrease, belief in new religions increases. So the substitution hypothesis is there a necessary connection between a decrease in one religion and an increase in another? In other words, is belief the default? Is belief the default? If belief is the default, then wouldn't it be better to keep eggs in structures that we know more or less yield human flourishing, like Christianity, certainly certain benign forms of Christianity? Wouldn't that be better than rolling the dice and risking it with wokeism or critical social justice? So I think atheism in one sense was the canary in the coal mine. The amazing thing about the atheist movement was that the atheists especially the atheists who are active atheists, went to conferences, etc., they themselves became religious. So there was a religion that arose within atheism. And it wasn't a Christianity, but it was a critical social justice. In fact, most of those atheist conferences, etc., they don't even talk about the existence for God. In fact, it's not even mentioned. What is mentioned is identity markers, the lack of women at conferences.
Really?
Oh yeah, this has been going on for years. They hunted out my buddy Dave Silverman. That's another story. But the atheist movement itself is religious. If
I
to the
So
extent that it's an
I
atheist movement
early
at
in
all.
my it's 2024, 15 years ago roughly. On my bus routes into Manhattan every day, I watched a 20-hour symposium called Beyond Belief that I found on the internet. And it was Dawkins and Sam Harris and it was like the leading lights of the new atheist movement
Yep.
in this conference that was filmed. And then like as an and then I went on a little tear reading all the intelligent design books. So I was having all kinds of fun. So you're saying now that kind of beyond belief conference is just critical social justice
All of it, yeah.
fest.
I mean, I haven't looked in the last couple of years, but for sure, I mean, the canary in the coal mine was skepticism, and then it went to atheism. But my point to you is that that's the substitution hypothesis. A point is the substitution hypothesis is as belief in Christianity has decreased, is wokeism something that it didn't have to necessarily be wokeism, but did something else have to fill that void? And if so, then shouldn't we nudge people toward more benign forms of delusion? Some guy rose from a tomb and he did that for your salvation and he loves you and he's watching you and he cares about you. Wouldn't that be better than teaching people that the whole system is oppressive and racist and needs to be ripped to the ground? Well, yeah. I mean,
What's
obviously
your
it would.
answer?
So
Yeah.
I'm not making the moral argument that we ought to nudge people into delusion, but I am saying that it clearly is true that certain forms of delusion are more harmful than others.
Do you feel like that substitution is not that we just have one example, but that does where do you stand on the belief spectrum here of that? Like, do
Yeah,
you think that that's right?
yeah. I asked Richard about that, and he said he doesn't think it's true because, well, he hopes it isn't, and he doesn't think it is. He said if it's true, his whole life's work can be thrown out. So I don't know whether or not the substitution hypothesis is true. I mean, if you look at Phil Zuckerman has some interesting work on this. If you look at the rates of belief in Scandinavia, for example, they're very small, God beliefs. Not many, almost, all the churches and cathedrals, et cetera, have been abandoned. But they believe in other things. Like Iceland, they believe in fairies and gnomes and pixies and garden sprites and all this stuff. So I don't know if the substitution hypothesis is true or not. But the question is, does that cause me to reflect on my work within atheism? The answer to that would be yes and no. Clearly, wokeism has been an unmitigated catastrophe for society at multiple levels, divisive, toxic. I don't know if I'd say ruinous because the jury's still out on that. So it both has and has not caused me to do that. I think that what's most important to think about is what is true. And I would not nudge people toward more benign delusions, but what I would do is I would be more likely to question people and ask them if I thought their beliefs were more detrimental or dangerous or harmful to themselves or society.
I mean, beyond the question of faith and combating that, I think the thing that's interesting to me when I think about earlier in our conversation, like being personally unable to grapple with whatever that that critical social justice paradigm
Yeah.
that you were laying out. And I actually I know those words, and I know like the construction of those words that sound like the philosophy I know how to do. You've done it you are the par excellence of doing that at the highest levels. Um, but the sort of way of thinking, the thing that I think I am curious about how you think about this is that at this intersection of, you know, how we know things, epistemology, and what we are as a creature, um, that is the thing that's become very interesting to me because, you know, we have the what we know things like physics and that have predictability that can be used, that, you know, we can use math to predict crazy things like quantum mechanics that are utterly bizarre, but it works. The math works. We don't have that for social, for human psychological reality. We don't have that math really for human flourishing or for how the human engine works. And like I feel like AI is starting to create this weird mirror that makes us ask, well, like what is it that constitutes thought and learning and knowing? Um, but there's something about, you know, is belief, can belief be understood as a fact of the human creature, not merely as like a substitute that's instrumental towards a pursuit of truth, but that it's woven into it. Maybe that's the closest I can get to the way these postmodernists think, because they're like, this is, these power relationships are a reality, and maybe I'm just saying, well, no, I actually think faith is kind of a fundamental reality of the human enterprise. Am I making any sense?
Yes and no. I'm trying to figure out what the through line is. I've been thinking about some things in the conversation. So among the things I'm thinking about are, so you and I can both look at a belief system, if not in the orbit of critical social justice, but we can look at a belief system that's radically different from our own. This is called the outsider test for faith. My buddy John Loftus wrote a book on this. We can look at those belief systems and see that there's something not right about that. That's probably too charitable. We can see that they're false. I can look at your belief system and I think you believe things that are clearly false. A kindness, if I want to be kind to you, I will be honest with you and tell you that. In fact, I just did. If
Yep.
you want to be kind to me, not nice to me, and frankly, if you want me to respect you more, if I am harboring beliefs about the nature of reality that are not true, I certainly want to know what those are. Like 100%. Like, why on earth would I want to be wrong for an instant more than I have to be? It doesn't even make any sense. So if this is the through line for what you're saying, like I'm pulling this out, I'm making inferences that those inferences may not be correct, but we have certain givens, right? We want to live in a society with each other. At least you and I do. These people, I don't know, they're less. They want something else. But you and I want to live harmoniously in a society where nobody's killing each other and committing social justice on the streets, and people are getting along, you know, reasonably, behaving civilly toward each other. Oh, did you laughing at that? Sorry.
Yeah, I'm sorry. Yeah.
No, sorry. I guess it lends itself to a kind of social question. Maybe not moral, might be too strong of a word, but to what extent is it incumbent upon you and I to engage each other about what we believe to help the other one figure out if we believe things about reality that are false? So if you said to me right now, listen, I'm only a Catholic because it makes me feel good. I don't actually believe any of it. I just go to church. I feel a great peace in church. In fact, I just got back from Taiwan, and literally 3 doors down or 4 doors down from where I live, there was a little Buddhist temple. And I used to stand in front of that. I just found it to be incredibly peaceful. But I didn't do that because I thought there was some kind of something would intervene in objective reality and, you know, make good things happen for me. Now I have to ask you if I'm making any sense. So I guess it depends on if one believes things because they think they're true, or they believe things because it makes them feel good.
I think one way I think I can try to lay this out
Okay.
is to say, okay, um, there's a sense in which the notion that all that's true is power seems to in fact be true, which is to say that
Sure.
the natural world works that way. Like evolution is a power struggle between an environment and the things that are most fit in that environment to survive. And that survival tends to be fairly brutal and fairly murderous. And so any notion of equal dignity is not true in some scientifically observable way. It's not. A person who's a 25 IQ, you talked about this earlier, at a purely materialist perspective, is not worth as much in our fitness environment as someone who's 130 IQ. They are not. They will not make it. They won't be able to hold down a job. They will not be able to survive. That's like an observable fact. So that gives rise to this challenge, I think, which is we are in this battle of ideas, and we have a set of assumptions that I would personally say are fundamentally religious. And that is that it is in fact good to have flourishing civilization.
Uh,
That claim that we rest on like it's a truth claim has nothing to do with the scientific method of material reality. It just doesn't. It is an axiom. It is an assertion below which it super turtles all the way down. Because the earth is not a being. It doesn't care if we are here or not. Um so and so
okay. Now
I think I'm
okay.
on solid.
I got you. I hear you.
Right. So
Yeah, I
so
hear
that's
you.
that's where it's like we have to rely on something. They are essentially sort of in a true sense kind of adopting a kind of materialist primitive view of the world of might makes right and saying no, that's reality. That's just it. That's reality. So there's always going to be strong men and weak men, and we should always try to be knocking down the strong men. And there's not, I guess that's the best I can do to try to get myself in that headspace. And my answer to that is, well, no, actually, we're created in the image of God, and that is the most sound, solid footing on which I can then build up liberalism and enlightenment values and virtues and the golden rule and all of the stuff on which we build the cathedral of the modern world. And so that's the part I'm grappling with right now, kind of at the most meta scale.
And when you say the part, like, what's the dichotomy there? The fact that that we should orient toward society toward flourishing is itself a religious claim. It's axiomatic and can't be rationally derivable.
Yes, that I guess that's my challenge. Is that true? Do you think that that's actually true? And if so, is that actually, and does that call into question? Does that just create a kind of faith leap for you?
No, I mean we need to really disambiguate a lot of these terms because there's a ton there, and in this conversation, it's so important to be precise in exactly what we mean. So let's toss out the word religious because it has too much baggage, and let's just
Sure.
say, should it be an axiom that society needs to lead toward flourishing, or is the fact of society building and constructing societies that lead toward human flourishing, is that itself rationally derivable? Like, can you just do Descartes' experiment or John Rawls' experiment and just sit down and think through it so that you can derive principles of justice, for example, or principles of fairness? So I've thought about this. So do you accept the framing of that question?
Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, I think in a way I am fundamentally posing the question that philosophy seeks to answer. So that, in a certain sense.
Yeah. So another way to even think about that is, are there moral facts?
Yeah,
Okay.
fair. Great. That's a great way to put it.
So I'm going to give you what I think you're looking for. Reed told me never to do that. He said, never say I'm going to give you what you're looking for. That's terrible. But I think I'm going to do it anyway. Passe Reed.
Give it a shot.
Okay. So yes, it is axiomatic. The question then becomes, what does flourishing look like? Because flourishing has radically different conceptions to different, you mentioned Islam, surrender. Flourishing has radically different conceptions to different people. So if I accept by fiat, this is a weird way to say it since it's axiomatic itself, but if I accept that that just should be the way we construct societies, is that not a kind of faith? And why don't I adopt some other axiom? Well, the history of Western intellectual thought is replete with answers to that question. I'll give you my take on that. If it is axiomatic, I don't understand what a competing axiom would be, because anything else would lead to your death. You know, why don't we just take up sledgehammers and, or machetes and kill each other? And someone could say, well, yeah. I had a guy, just parenthetically, I had a guy in class once, and I was talking about moral facts, and he was just saying, he just was not buying it at all. And then I showed pictures of people in Africa who were victims in the war, and they had their limbs were cut off, and they had just basically stumps. And I showed him this, and I said, is it a moral fact that this is bad? That this type of life is not as good as the type of life where someone had arms, legs, and hands? And he said to me, well, how do you know some greater understanding and insight didn't result from this when they got their limbs cut off? And I said, if you actually believe that, why don't you cut off your limbs? Why don't you just go and take a saw and start? Now, I said that years ago. I could never have said that to at the end. I would have been instantly taken to the diversity office, and that would have been a career ender. But the point in that, the point of that is, it seems that it is true. People have tried to smuggle in that conception of flourishing to their moral schema. They've tried to kind of surreptitiously, sneak it in through the back somewhere, through some kind of, I don't know, sophisticated, specious reasoning. And when you really look at it from the 30,000 foot high, it's a vertiginous proposition. It causes vertigo just thinking about it, because it's so complex.
One thing I'm hearing as you're grappling with this is that if you start with the human desire to survive, or the sort of the impulse of life itself, right, is to continue to be. And so you can kind of start there and say, well, that's just an observable reality. Human beings and all living things want to continue to exist, and for that existence to be as long and as comfortable as can be. We want to reduce discomfort. We want to extend the time that we have, and those are just basic facts, and we can test those and experiments, but the experiment of reality makes that pretty obvious. And so from there we can build, and you get to a kind of secular humanism, utilitarian math from there. I mean, maybe that's enough. It just seems like,
yeah, maybe
environmentalism in particular posits is a very different moral framework that says, no, actually a billion lives isn't as important as a flourishing ecosystem, according to friends of Bill McKibben's. It's like they're like, we're just waiting for another virus to come along and wipe out the locust of humanity. So they've got a different structure than that one.
So Beyond Lauenberg, by the way, has addressed those claims very well. It seems to me, instead of asking that question, which is a philosophically important question, but it doesn't seem, to me at least, to do a lot of work for society, the real question we should be asking is, if we can all agree on flourishing, what does that look like? What does it look like for civilization to flourish? It's funny, my friend Faisal Al-Mutar, who runs Ideas Beyond Borders, said something. This guy is awesome. If you've ever had an opportunity to spend time with him, It's like dog years. Like spending 1 minute with him is like spending 7 years with anybody else. I was telling him that isn't the best argument for Islamic fundamentalists to adopt secularism is that they will be able to participate in their religion freely and openly, and it's no problem. Like, why wouldn't somebody want that? He said, man, you don't understand at all. Even asking that question means you don't understand. What Islamic fundamentalists want, or the term fundamentalist is problematic, but let's say Islamic extremists, what Islamic extremists want is for everybody to be an Islamic extremist. It's to believe what they believe. So secularism then is not the solution if everybody wants to be an Islamic fundamentalist, or if they want everyone to be an Islamic extremist. So then the question becomes, what does it look like to have societies that flourish? And there are radically different answers to that question. And it seems so obvious to me that there are better answers to that question than others. Look, the moment that you say there are worse answers to that question, like chopping off everybody's arm, then, and I can actually, if you want to spend a minute on it, I can actually run you through the experiment.
Yeah, let's do it. And this would be a great, I know, this would be a great place for us to sort of draw to a conclusion. It's like this, because this is the question that I think the most charitable read of everyone from every angle is, which is, what is the question of living in a flourishing society?
Okay.
Like that, I think is a great.
Okay, let's go for it. Okay, so let's say that there were a meteor tomorrow, and then this meteor would just scrape the tangent of planet Earth. And let's say that it would drop some kind of I don't know, virus or something. The consequences of the virus are the following. We would have diarrhea 10 times a day. We would vomit 10 times a day, and our vision would be significantly impaired. All right, is that clear so far?
Yep.
Okay. So you could find literally anybody in the world and ask them, if somebody works toward alleviating that suffering, and maybe you have a problem with the word suffering, we can talk about that. If someone is working to create a pill, so instead of having diarrhea and vomiting 10 times a day, you only do it 8 times a day, is it reasonable to apply the word good to that? It doesn't matter what culture you're in, the answer will be yes. Now the question becomes, is that a moral good or a practical good? Is it a morally good? I would argue that it's a moral good. But I'm also open to the argument that, in fact, it's probably true as well, that it's also a practical good. So then the question becomes, well, what if you do just the opposite? What if somebody works toward making the problem worse and making them diarrhea 12 times a day and vomit blood 12 times a day? Is that a practical problem or is that a moral problem? Again, it's probably both. The question is it possible to rationally derive the idea that human flourishing is good? If you seat that in what I think maybe even everybody, although, with billions of people on the earth, I'm hesitant to say everybody, I'm also aware of the trap that you don't want to get into the majority view, like the majority of people.
Right. It does sound like, what's true is what everyone believes. And that's not, that's
Right.
a weak argument.
There is, however, this is why moral reasoning is very complicated. There does seem to be a utilitarian component in this. There does seem to be a component of the greatest good for the greatest number of people. There does seem to be a component of, we have to, at the end of the day, it just seems to me you have to assume by fiat certain basic assumptions for how society ought to live. And if somebody does not accept those assumptions, for example, if somebody wants to put some chemical in the water supply to make everybody have diarrhea 20 times a day and vomit 100 times a day, we have to, at some point, call that bad. Now, you can do the Nietzschean switch and say, well, we call that evil. You call whatever you want. But the word that you use will determine whether it's just a practical concern or a moral concern. So
I have a hypothesis.
please.
that derives from that layout in the, because I think it is, you are, I think I think maybe it's fair to say that there is a utilitarian math, as you said, in that, which is to say that people don't like to suffer, especially vomiting and especially having it come out of both ends 10 times a day. That's
Right.
like,
That's
good
why I
luck
use that
finding
example.
even
I wanted an extreme example.
yeah. So the extreme example brings clarity to a shared definition of suffering.
Exactly.
And so we can sort of all get on board more or less, except for sadists or masochists. I sometimes forget which is which. That's okay. That's bad, and we less of that, therefore, is good. I think one of the many challenges that we now face as a creature, and this is again where my faith has come back into the foreground as I've thought about this more, is that, and I think this comes back to what's happening in high school debate and college campuses and the West and this, especially the Anglosphere, is the things that caused us suffering. We have now started to encroach and eliminate the things that have caused us suffering that were also essential lessons for how to develop capacity of adulthood. So
Agreed.
So waiting is suffering. So we don't, but, and we've almost eliminated all waiting all the time. So now we can get whatever we want with one click. We can get a car with one click, food with one click, shelter with one click. We literally have apps for that. Discomfort is suffering. We want to reduce discomfort. So now we've hit the point where all aggression by historical standards, Steven Pinker style, has been like wiped off the face of our kids' lives for sure. And so they've sort of just reattenuated. So now we don't have aggression. We have microaggressions, but they feel like real aggression to the people who experience them, even though they. And so I think this is where this interesting challenge is, that I think even in this conversation, it has made me empathize a little bit more with what I think we both consider to be like whacked out, lunatic, sociopathic beliefs on this identitarian landscape, which is we've sandblasted away things that are suffering for real. And with them, we have thrown a baby out with that bathwater, and we have not yet developed, you're a big fan of jujitsu. That is like a conscious choice to engage in battle and physicality and pain and suffering.
Correct.
Because it brings benefits.
Correct.
And I think we are at the moment we're in, maybe because we have reached a point where all of that, for a lot of people, billions of people, now has to be a conscious choice instead of an accepted, inescapable reality.
Correct.
What do you think about that as a hypothesis?
I think it's fascinating. I think one of the reasons jiu-jitsu is popular is because we've lost that so much. Jiu-jitsu is like ubiquitous. I routinely run into people who are serious practitioners, but
jiu-jitsu, cold plunging, fasting, all the Huberman stuff.
Yeah,
it's
I follow him.
Okay, now you're going to have to
follow him on Twitter. You started off saying something I think it's important. Yes, we both recognize these beliefs that have taken over society as wackadoodle, like no question about it. And I think it's important to remember at core that when you really crystallize it down, many of those beliefs are actually true. There is oppression. There is racism. I don't think that there's discrimination, systemic discrimination currently, but actually against Asians on college campuses, but against Jews. Okay, so I take it back about systemic discrimination, but that's not how they use the term. So there are historical injustices, horrific injustices against homosexuals. Look at Alan Turing. I mean, miscegenation laws in the United States, you couldn't marry someone of a different race. I mean, there's just no question about this, that many of these claims are correct. As we move forward, the question becomes, how do we address these? Should we address these? Is the equity-based lens the way to remediate these injustices? But no matter what you say the solution is, the way to get to the solution has to be reason. It has to be dialogue. It has to be if not debate, then at the very least conversation. It has to be some kind of a pushback on the ideas. And that's what they have fundamentally misconstrued. That's what they have wrong. Not that there are not people being oppressed or that there is an environmental racism or degradation that we have to address in some meaningful way. But what is the way to figure that out of how to move forward as a society? Well, there's only one way, and that is reason, evidence, and argument. But that gets back to peer-reviewed, the peer-reviewed journal, the peer-reviewed process. That's why we need peer-reviewed processes and journals that are as much as possible free from ideology. They have to be beacons people trust. They have to be lodestars that people can look to figure out this is the best available evidence. We've tried to falsify this. Now let's bring that into our debates. Now let's bring that into our conversations. Now we can have a meaningful conversation about the role of equity or about the role of equality. And that's what they have wrong. And not wrong in a minor way either.
That is a fantastic place for us to draw our conversation to a close. It will certainly be continued. I ask this of every guest. We call this show, the podcast, Dad Saves America, because I think, and I think you and I, just from your bio that we started with, rank this high in terms of the roles we can take on as men that matter and that promote human flourishing and that through our own agency make the world a better place. How do you think about your role in the American story?
Well, it's my sincere hope that I've provided something of value. My dad used to tell me, leave the world better after you've left it than when you've come into it. It's my hope that I've made the world a little more civil. I've made the world a little more kind. But it's my greatest hope that I've given people the tools to enable them to think about issues in a way that helps them navigate reality in a more meaningful way, helps them calibrate the confidence in their beliefs to the evidence, shows them why that matters. I hope that in some small way, the contribution that I've made will ameliorate human suffering, will contribute to people's ability to think clearly. That's my hope. Ultimately, I really have no idea. I guess I don't think about my contribution. I think about just trying to do the best work I can to move the needle on irrationality and divisiveness.
Peter, thanks for being on Dad Saves America.
Thanks, John.